My background is in doing, new plays, directing new work for the theater, and developing new work for the theater. And for a number of years, some of my favorite theater that I've worked on has been theater that comes out of the process of interviewing people and then using the actual words of the people. You're kind of bound by that to create a new play from the stories of people telling their stories. So it has some like oral history elements to it, some anthropological elements to it, but the goal is to take some community or societal issue that is significant and try to understand it by telling stories about it. So that kind of theater is called the theater of testimony or the theater of ethnography. And the idea comes out of that, like listening to the voices that we don't normally hear, the people who are marginalized, the people who are oppressed. For example, Anna Deavere Smith, who's probably doing some of the most important work in this regard, really has examined issues of race and racial identity in community. There's other groups like Emily Mann, who was at the McCarter Theater in New Jersey. She does work on she's done work on Vietnam veterans. She's done work on issues of also on issues of race, and then there's other people who have worked on like AIDS awareness issues, and other people who have worked on mental illness, and other people who do work on the struggles with environment and sustainability. So there's all kinds of work going on out there in this way. It's like a whole body of theater for social justice work that's going on. Well, I think it's kind of like the same way that you might be interested in making a documentary film instead of a piece of fiction, because there's a kind of journalistic element to it where you are seeking out the truth from a perspective that's not your own. And that is interesting to me, the idea of creating empathy and understanding from the perspective of the people who are in the midst of the struggle. So if you're working on racism, for example, then you're really interviewing people and talking to them from their racial perspective. If you're working on poverty, you're not just looking at this and examining it from your own perspective, you're talking to people who are experiencing it. So and with sexuality, it's the same thing. I'm not a gay or lesbian person, but I know a tremendous number of people who are, and I can't really get their perspective without talking to them and listening to them. And I want to resolve myself to be able to listen to stories of people who are different from me and try to understand it from their perspective. That's the only way you can build empathy. The first thing that happened to me that made me start walking down this path of creating this was that a young man came into my office at Calvin College, where I work, and he said, I'm gay. He came out to me, and I'm going to go home. It's Thanksgiving weekend. I'm going to go home and tell my family, and I'm really scared. And he was crying and shaking and tearful, and what I couldn't understand at that point, I sat there and I prayed with him. I held his hand. I talked to him. I told him that I cared about him. I listened to what he had to say. I listened to his story. But I realized that I didn't have any real answer. I couldn't really talk to him about this because I didn't have enough knowledge about it myself. And when he came back from the holidays and told me what had happened and that his parents had basically rejected him and that he was even more afraid of what was going to happen in his whole community, I then said, I need to at least start reading about this and start having some knowledge about this. So that's when I started to read and listen, and I wanted to know what my church's perspective was, because I actually, to tell you the honest truth, I didn't know. So I read the reports of the Christian Reformed Church, which I'm a member of, about homosexuality and Christianity. And there were some words that really struck me in one of their reports, which there was a prayer that was written. And in this prayer, they specifically said, strengthen our resolve to listen to their stories, to share their pain, to understand, basically to try to understand from their perspective what was going on so that we could walk together, so that we would be able to walk together. And that stayed with me the whole time. And I thought, I was teaching ethnographic theater at the time. I thought, I've never made a piece like this before, but this would be such an interesting issue to explore in this way. So I started to, at that point, I started to interview people. To tell you the truth, I hadn't created any sense of, I didn't really know what questions to ask even, you know? I just wanted to hear from their perspective what their story was. So I did the first 4 interviews in 2004, like the winter of 2004. And I asked these 4 people who I interviewed just to try to tell me their story, to try to talk about what it was that meant something to them about their experience of being gay and lesbian and Christian, like what was going on in their hearts and their minds, and what was it like for them to try to live authentically. What were they struggling with? Where were they at? And it was such an interesting group of interviews. I mean, I look back at those interviews now, and I didn't even have the questions formulated, you know. So now, but one of the things that all of them talked about were the scriptures, that they had studied these scriptures in the Bible, and they had really, this is where the center of their struggle seemed to be in Scripture and scriptural interpretation, and then how the church was using that scriptural interpretation. I mean, they were struggling with that. And I hadn't come up with any idea about how to frame this yet or anything like that, but many people I interviewed wanted to talk about the Bible. And so I thought, well, I need to look at those scriptures a lot more intently, and I need to talk to a lot of people about this. So I started reading these passages, and it depends on who you talk to. Some people say there's 6 passages in Scripture. Some people say there's 7. Some people say there's 8. It just depends. But the first number I remember anybody saying to me was 7. And so I looked at them and started to study them, and listened to what other people had to say about them in the context of all of Scripture, not just in the context of those isolated passages. But people had a lot to say about them, and I realized that this was in some ways what was framing their existence, and their stories were coming out of their response to this. So I just kept listening and then those interviews lasted, we did 127 interviews, and they lasted, it took us until the spring of 2007 to complete 127 interviews. And they range from people who are, 80 to people who were 18. That was the youngest. And then people who are, African American, people who are white, people who are Latino, people who come from all denominational backgrounds, Catholic and Protestant backgrounds, many Protestant backgrounds. And the one thing we said, because it wasn't just me doing this, it was a team of researchers, and it was actually the people who eventually acted in the performances were the people who were helping with the interview process. So they were involved with the research all along. We were reading books together and talking. So there's 127 interviews that we did. We took them and transcribed them very, very carefully, word for word, corrected each other's transcriptions, made sure that they were all accurate, and then we chose from that material very careful and thorough selection process what to use. The one thing that bound all the interviews together is that every single person we interviewed had to be able to say, I'm gay, I'm a gay or lesbian person, and I'm a Christian. It didn't mean they necessarily had to be going to church at the time, but they had to be able to say that about themselves. So then we narrowed the framework to that, and because otherwise you would have been interviewing people forever. And we also only interviewed people in Western Michigan. You always start in this kind of a process with people who you know and trust, and those people are called like your informants. And so if you have when you go into an issue that you know nothing about, you've got to be able to talk to somebody about it really openly and say, I'm sorry, I don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? I don't know what this means. I don't know what's going on here. So that's one of the things that the informants do. The other thing they do is they help you to meet people who might not necessarily come forward to be willing to be interviewed. So I started out with working with some key people in the community who were those informants for me, and they helped me to recruit people to interview. And then it just did what you call a snowball sample at that point. Then it just starts to be everybody knows other people, and they start to just come in. And all of a sudden you have more people to interview than you possibly have time to interview. And then there's another process, though, that has to happen, which is that you don't want all the interviews to be what are called self-selecting subjects. Because lots of people who will come forward first, you know, yeah, you want those people too, but you want to make sure that you're getting people who don't necessarily want to talk about this and who, for whatever reason. So I managed to interview a large number of people in the sample who were not self-selecting not because I badgered them into it or anything like that, but because of starting a conversation with them, making them feel safe, letting them talk to other people who had been interviewed. And then slowly I got interviews with people who were much less, well, they were fearful of talking. Many of the interviews are not anonymous because people didn't want to, people were very afraid of speaking out loud and having their name known. So I, you know, obviously let them be anonymous interview subjects. But the stories, those anonymous stories are, you know, some of the most painful ones in there. And then you also had to make sure that you were getting varying opinions, you know, because a lot of the stories started to sound kind of the same. And so, but I wanted to make sure that there were people in there who had differing opinions on the subject, so it didn't all sound like some monolithic voice that was, you know, what makes it interesting is when there are differences in opinion. And that's what you need in order to get a decent understanding of the whole issue. One of the stories that is the most moving to me is of a young man who, I think he was in his 30s when I interviewed him. And he is an anonymous person, anonymous man number 13. He decided that he is going to be celibate. And the reason that he decided to be celibate is because he was so conflicted about the scriptures and about what his church's denominational standpoint was, that he decided that he couldn't have couldn't practice. Because there's a lot of churches who say, yes, we accept you as gay and lesbian people into our community, but you may not practice. That is a key viewpoint. And he was a member of a church that was like that. And so he had decided to be celibate. And he was one of the most eloquent and just loving, like his words were so loving even towards the situation that he was in. But he was in a lot of pain. And then another extreme were people who were married in heterosexual relationships and who had known that they were gay for a while or lesbian for a while, and yet they were going to remain in that heterosexual relationship, and that the pain that they were struggling with in that case and how they were going to make it through life under the decisions that they had made. So those stories were difficult to listen to. The people were in a lot of pain. And then on the other extreme, you know, you've got people who are saying, I got no problem with what the scriptures say about this at all, and like they're in a gay relationship, and they are living, they have found a way to live authentically as gay or lesbian and Christian, and they're completely open about it, and they go to churches. Most of them go to churches that are what are called affirming churches, because there's a whole spectrum of churches, you know, from the most prohibitive who say you can't even say that you're gay or lesbian, and to the churches who are, you know, completely say that there's no problem whatsoever with gay relationships. Like and there's a whole host of viewpoints in between, and so I interviewed all sides of that spectrum. The The one interview that I tried to get that I really wanted and maybe missed the opportunity to get, and I tried, whereas I wanted to interview people who said, I've been healed of this. Like, because there's a number of programs out there where you can go through like a sort of counseling process and so on and be healed. Now, I interviewed people who went through those kinds of programs and who said that they weren't healed. But I never met anybody, or at least I didn't find anybody who was willing to talk to me. I did meet a couple of people, but they weren't willing to be interviewed, who said that they were healed completely. And I wish they'd let me interview them, because I would have liked to have had that perspective in there as well. I know that perspective exists, it just isn't in the work at this stage. I am a member of the Christian Reformed Church, and it's much more complex than I can just sort of throw out here, but their idea, or the official stance of the church is that we want gay and lesbian people to be members of churches and to invite them in and have them be, but they have this non-practicing clause, you know. They agree that homosexuality is a biological identity, you know, but they say, but you can't practice it. And I'm struggling with this too, because this is what my church, the church in which that I profess my faith, is struggling with this. And you know, so the last time they produced a report on this was in 2002. I think it's time for another opening up of the issue, another examination of it. I don't know when that's slated to happen, but it should happen again. I mean, churches are dealing with this. It's causing a huge amount of divisiveness in churches, and that's why I wanted this play. I wanted this play, and then now this film, to be able to open doors for dialogue and discussion without causing divisiveness, but really to have a sense of, you know, we can talk about this, we can listen to this, we can do this without getting into difficult areas of argument. We can listen. We have this ability. And I think it was, I think that we need to be able to examine ourselves and go through that introspective process of examining our beliefs, ourselves. We have to be able to do that. We cannot just walk through life with blinders on, you know. So that's where I'm at with the way the church is approaching it right now. I want to be a part of the discussion that moves forward to look at this again. I had been commissioned by Actors Theatre Grand Rapids to write this, to put this together, and so they were no matter what, Actors Theatre was going to be the first people to do it. And they were a perfect group to do it, because they have this in their mission statement, you know, this statement that they are going to you know, do a lot of work that supports things that are going on in their community. And West Michigan is the sort of Bible Belt of Michigan, I guess you could say. And this is a major issue here, so of course they were interested in that. The difficulties we ran into in producing this were many. You know, it wasn't so hard to get the interviews as it was to eventually try to decide as a group who's creating it, because this was a group of, I think there were 12 of us total who were actually working on forming the script, to try to get us to agree, because we all had different perspectives. But the words that kept us together were, the one thing that bound us together is that we had this common goal of creating dialogue and discussion around what was happening in the interview subjects' lives. And we loved the people who we had interviewed. I mean, we had grown to have a real sense of love for them, because, you know, we'd talked to them and written, you know, transcribed their words, and you kind of feel like you know them all of a sudden in this very personal way. So you have this personal responsibility to them. So we knew we wanted that, and so we looked for stories when we were editing the material. We looked for stories that were representative of the whole, and we also said, everything we put in here really needs to have something to do with faith and spirituality and sexuality. Like that has to be a crossroads of the material. Because there are some great stories, wonderful stories, but they had nothing to do with the church or nothing to do with faith. And so we wanted to keep it focused on that. And so that was hard, because we would make decisions to cut something because the subject matter wasn't relevant. Even though we loved the person and hated, sort of felt like you're cutting a person out. However, when people who were interviewed came to see the initial production of the play, which opened in September of 2007, many of the comments that I received from the people who were interviewed, which we invited them to come to a special performance, many of them said, my story wasn't in there, but I felt like I was in there. My voice was there. And this is one of the most important aspects of this kind of theater, is that people feel empowered by the fact that they're being listened to. That's the power of testimony. And that was incredible to witness. And then the other thing that was incredible to witness is when we did finally, well, at one point we thought we had made such great progress on editing all this stuff, and we read it and it was 12 hours long. And we said, oh, I guess we've got another phase or two to go. So then that was the hard part. That was in July of 2007 when we had this massive amount of material still. And we had to have a script by August 15th. So it became this, very, very careful still, but we had to cut a lot. And then when we had a final script, we read it, and it was like this just epiphany that what we had done was good, but we still were not happy totally with it. I mean, it still continued to go through change. I think we were just relieved to have finally gotten it down to be to the size and length that it was. One of the things I wanted was that I wanted it to run without an intermission, straight through, 90 to 100 minutes long, so that you could listen to the whole thing. You could get the whole, many people, and I would never force anybody to talk about this, but many people will walk away at an intermission because they either can't handle it or they don't like what's happening to them as they watch it. So I wanted a full breadth of them being able to get this all in one place at one time, and then to be able to talk about it. So we had these wonderful discussions every night after the initial performances, which were well attended. I mean, normally with talk-back performances at a play, like 10 people stay, like this. And so this was every performance of this play was sold out, and everybody stayed. I mean, some people left because they had to, or because maybe they felt like they couldn't stay there to talk. But many, many times that the audience was packed for those discussions, and I'd never seen that happen before. In these post-show discussions that we had, most of the people who stayed were either very curious and wanted to talk and ask questions, or they were extremely supportive because of either they had somebody in their family or they themselves were a gay or lesbian Christian. Some people did stay to ask challenging questions. Nobody protested or caused, a fuss, but they were dignified and probing questions that were asked, and I think that it ended up being a very good discussion. The most amazing performance of all, I think, of that opening production was we decided to do a special performance of the play for pastors and people in pastoral leadership positions in Michigan. And so we sent out invitations. We didn't charge them to come to this. And we set up that there would be these facilitated dialogues that took place after a scene. So on a Thursday morning, which was our first performance of the play we did, Thursday morning, September 27th, we had a group of pastors, a full house of pastors who came from all over Michigan to see it and participate in the discussion. And the pastors who were there ranged from people from the most conservative churches to the most affirming churches. less on the conservative side, but still there were some people there. And it was incredible. They stood to their feet immediately at the end of the performance, and it was, well, it just blew me away. I was sitting in the back of the house and I watched this happen, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And then in the discussions afterwards, and then they had like a long, like 2-hour facilitated discussion in small groups. And then we came back together as a group, and they discussed what had happened in those discussions. And it was, I mean, I was sitting there crying because it was people were truly saying, you know, that this was one of the first times they had really understood from this point of view of empathy. And that they recognized that this was incredibly important. And it was at that meeting that afterwards where somebody said, please turn this into a film so that other churches can, so that our church and other churches can have a chance to actually show this and have this be a real tool in our churches to build empathy and understanding. And I said, oh, I don't know if I can do that. And then somebody at that started donating money right there on the spot. So that's how this all came about. In this kind of theater, where you have, you know, a research team that does all the research and background and then turns it into a script and then produces and performs it, it's been sort of a tradition of that kind of theater that you have a core group of performers who play multiple roles. One of the things that's important about that approach is that they, first of all, they were the people who were doing the work, you know, and so they have a better understanding of how to perform the story. But, you know, the other thing about having one actor play multiple roles is it's like what that person, we're all people, you know, every single one of these. So it does make this interesting connection that, you know, we are all the same on one level, you know. We're all experiencing similar kinds of things, even though, you know, we're very different from each other at the same time. So that single actor playing 2, 3, 4 roles gives you that sense of common humanity. And these particular performers that are in this piece, in 7 Passages, they exhibited a kind of love toward the subject matter, a kind of giving toward the subject matter. That was what was most important to me. And some of them had great senses of humor so that they could capture the spirit. Some people's approach to the oppression that they deal with is humor, you know? So you have to have people who have a good sense of humor. A good sense of just technique about truthfulness, that you're speaking the truth. And there's a reverence towards speaking the truth of how these people feel. And there's a social responsibility of speaking it from different perspectives. So all of these people have that and dedicated themselves to that cause. And, you know, one of the things that happened in the original production actually is that we did not have an African American performer playing a couple of black characters. And that was a criticism, a major criticism by people especially in the African American community. And I said, well, I'm going to have to change that for the next productions. And so we hired an African American actor, Frank, to come in and play the black characters. And he was part of the second cast where I produced the play at Western Michigan University. So he had the same spirit of social responsibility and building empathy and understanding. And he's a gay Christian himself, so he definitely had this, you know, very real experience. The people on the team that created it and performed it, they came from all over the map in terms of their beliefs and their attitudes. I mean, one person who's on that team, you know, isn't, has real problems with the church and says, I've got a major problem with the church and how they're handling this. Other people are, committed members of churches and say, and of conservative churches and say, I want to figure this out. So we had a range of perspectives from different denominational backgrounds, from different walks of life, different classes, different statuses, and the one thing that binds us all together is we love doing theater and we love doing, exploring issues that mean something to our community. Well, the first performance in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which was in September and October of 2007, played to over 2,500 people. I don't remember exactly how many performances that would make, but all of the performances were sold out. And then we opened it in Western Michigan University in February of 2008, and we did the same thing that we had done in Grand Rapids, where we invited pastors to come to the first performance and had a small conference for them, discussions and so on. And then we ran it to sold-out houses at Western Michigan University and had to extend the run. And still, people were like, what do you, are there going to be more productions? And then at that, it was at that particular pastors' conference in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that a clergy person approached me and said, from the Episcopal Church, and said, have you thought about taking this to Lambeth? Well, Lambeth is where it only happens every 10 years. It's where the Archbishop of Canterbury from the UK says to the entire worldwide Anglican Union, which includes the Episcopal Church in America and the Anglican Church all over the world, says, come and visit me in Canterbury, England, and let's talk about what's happening with our church. And there's no official decisions or anything made at this, but it's just like, let's get together and talk. And the Episcopal Church is being split down the middle over the issue of homosexuality and the ordination of people who are practicing gay and lesbian people. They do ordain practicing gay and lesbian people, but it's just splitting the church in right down the center. And Bishop Rowan Williams, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's trying to hold the church together. He's trying to keep the discussions going. And so they knew this would be a significant issue at the conference. So they said, well, let's try, do you think we could get some money to go? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. We could try. So the Arcus Foundation gave us the money to take this on tour to Lambeth, UK. And it was incredible. It was, the play was seen by a large number of bishops of the Anglican Church. And we had these incredible discussions with people. And we realized that even if people were opposed to making some of the changes that were knocking at the door, so to speak, people really needed to talk about this. And they needed a way to talk about it that framed it so that it wasn't dangerous to talk about. And that's what stories do. That's what art does. It gives you a means to be able to explore something through a different avenue that you don't then feel like, I'm being personally attacked, You can come at it from a different angle. Well, of course, making a film is different from making a play, and there aren't very many good performances that on stage that have been taped and like, oh, you say, oh, that's a good film, because it's a stage performance, it's different. So we decided to film it on location in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where many, many, many of the interviews had taken place. And the idea behind this was that people were telling their stories to like somebody who was listening to them in the city, in this community. We decided to shoot it in the winter because that's one of the most striking seasons it just defines Western Michigan. The winter seems to define us a lot. And there were many people who talked about, in particular, there was one interview where a woman talked about feeling like she was an exposed body in winter as a lesbian Christian. And I thought that is such an interesting metaphor for what so many people are feeling. And that gave me the idea of shooting it in winter. So we went out and tested and did some testing of location and how this might happen, and we realized that it was possible, but that it was going to be a lot of work. The first thing that had to happen is we had to write a new script, because the script of the play worked in one way, but this needed to be different. You know, you needed different. We went back into the original interview material to look for a material that might work better on film, and so new script, similar but new. And then we had to find all the locations that would work in Grand Rapids: churches and city streets and parks and you know, bridges and coffee shops and restaurants and, you know, open fields. Wherever we tried to find a location for each of an environment for each of the subjects that would really work to show who they were and what their story was and how they were feeling. So I guess it's sort of environment as expression of what's happening with the person. And maybe it's where they work, or maybe it's just, maybe it's where they go for a walk. Maybe it's the, you know, a place of solace to them. Anyway, maybe it's their front porch. But we looked for places like that that helped them, to help the actor to find the environment of the character. And we spent a lot of days, very cold winter days, outside, all of us on the crew, freezing, many times freezing in the early morning, or even during, like sometimes in Western Michigan in the afternoon in the winter is just as cold as the morning. One of the key differences between the play and the film is that the principle of repetition on stage works really well as an artistic tool. Like choral voices speaking together on stage and things like that, and the same theme coming back and back and back. It doesn't work so well on film. There's something about the dimension of film as an art form that repetition kills it rather than helps it. You know, you can use like a recurring image or something like that, and that's not so bad. But if you have somebody speaking the same words over and over again, it just becomes redundant. So we had to find ways to edit the film that would make that, keep it dynamic rather than repetitive. So that was a challenge. On stage, I would have maybe two people on stage saying almost exactly the same thing, and they would be in sort of a conversation with each other on stage, even though they were not in the same room. And you can't, it didn't work to do that on film because when you juxtapose and place different film pieces together in the editing process, you're kind of doing that same thing that you were doing on stage, but you don't need as much of it. You know, it doesn't need to be the editing process makes it a totally different kind of dynamic. So we had to cut a lot of things that we had kept in that were like that, and the film script ended up being much longer than the play script, and then came way back down in the editing process, which is sort of the way it works. Like, you shoot more than you need. This whole process, from the very beginning, when the interview process started, all the way through to the end of filming, was an incredible challenge, because all of these people who are working on this have day jobs, and they're dedicated to doing this kind of theater and this kind of art as a means of building social community and building, you know, it's like it's more than, acting is for them much more than a hobby. It's a vocation. It's something they dedicate themselves to, so that they're doing this outside of their work life. And so it was just hard to get all the scheduling done. I mean, we had this deadline that winter was ending, you know, any day. And we had to get all of this shooting done when there was snow on the ground and when there was ice on the river and so on. And so it was difficult to get all of that in, because and they weren't doing it totally volunteer, but they were dedicating huge amounts of their time and energy. And that's where the real love comes through, is that they wanted to do this and volunteered so much of who they were to do it. I think the biggest surprise to me, which was a positive surprise, was that the material worked in a different medium, you know? Because I'm so used to building stage performances that and stage pictures, that I wasn't sure, like, would this material really frame up well? You know, would it work as a sequence of film images, or would this just be a big jumbled mess? And what I was surprised by is that it really worked. I think probably more than anything because of the principle of juxtaposition, which in art is very important, especially in contemporary art. So we're used to that, you know, we're used to watching stuff where we're like, things are being juxtaposed and we're seeing things back and forth and we can hold the context in our mind. And that was a positive experience for me to say, oh, this sense of juxtaposition that I had worked with on stage really did translate to film, and the medium did copy. There were some things I was disappointed in, like there were, oh gosh, you know, some of the material that we cut from the film. I fought to keep things, but I lost a lot of them. Not all of those battles, but I lost some of them because other people who were working on it, editors and so on, were right, you know, that this wasn't going to work. So I had to give up some things that were in the original play that I had just personally grown to love. And I think it was David Mamet who once said I think about playwriting, he's like, cut your favorite part. Always cut your favorite part. And I remember learning that for the first time when I was working on, as I was working on my own writing, and I was like, yeah, you got to cut the monologue or the scene or the dialogue where it's your favorite thing, because it probably means you're being self-indulgent and just playing favorites with some of the language you've come up with or some of the language that somebody has said, and it may not really work. The reason why this makes sense to do in Western Michigan and in Grand Rapids in particular, because we have a huge number of churches in this community. I don't remember the exact statistic, but there are, I mean, some people call this the city of churches. I mean, there are so many churches here. So I don't know the exact statistic on how many people go to church, but it's more than you find in other communities around the country. And I mean, there's probably some communities that are more religious than Grand Rapids, but for the most part. And this is the center of life for a lot of people. And also, there are a huge number or growing population of gay and lesbian people, LGBT people in Grand Rapids, who are very active in the community and very outspoken sometimes about their identities, and really working for social change and so on. And I realized that this was like, what an interesting place to do an ethnography like this, because there's some direct conflict going on. And the reason, I mean, you couldn't do it in New York or San Francisco or LA or you know, Chicago, but it makes sense for it to be based in its own community, based in born here and then done here. I'm sure it is being done elsewhere too, but the sense of having, you know, it spring from this community. It's called, this kind of theater is also called community-based drama. So what are an issue in your community that you really need to talk about? And this was clearly one that we needed to talk about. You cannot open the paper and not find something about the church and homosexuality in it. I mean, it spikes at certain points, and then other times it's less, but it's there. Like, this issue is there all the time. So it is one of the key social issues of our moment, of our history. And I think we're supposed to be looking at it and dealing with it and talking about it and not ignoring it. I mean, as a Christian, I feel like it's even part of my vocation to say, you know, I can go off and direct musicals and things like that don't, you know, and plays from the past. I mean, I enjoy doing that too. But in some ways, as a Christian, I think you're supposed to be engaging with the issues that are relevant to the society and the moment of time you find yourself in. You know, you're not supposed to be ignoring those things. I mean, if you use Christ as an example of following a vocation, I mean, Christ was directly engaging through talking to people and telling stories with the people of his time. And that is, I think, that's like everybody says, you're supposed to be like Christ. So how do you become like that? Well, you practice the actions of that person. And, I mean, the listening, the engagement, the speaking directly to an issue through, like, the beauty of a parable or the gorgeous words of a sermon but really, when it comes down to it, it was so much, I think, listening to the people that were surrounding him, and I think that's what we're supposed to be doing. I have two goals in mind in terms of what I hope this will accomplish. One is a personal goal, and like for individuals to say to themselves, what are my beliefs about this? And examine those beliefs, test them by fire, and perhaps start listening to what's happening around you in your church, at work, and so on. What's going on with me personally with this? And second would be for institutions, whether they are churches or schools or any kind of institution, really, clubs and community centers and stuff like that, to say, what are we doing to listen to and accept and understand what's happening with our institution? Because any kind of oppression that exists, racism, sexism, anything like that, including oppression of people who are gay and lesbian, it falls under those two fronts: institutional or systematized oppression, and individual. And you have to work at it on both levels. The institutions have to deal with it, the people have to deal with it. And it has to be ongoing. It can't be like, oh, well, we're going to do this one, seminar and then be done with this issue. It has to be ongoing. It has to be, I'm going to build personal relationships. I'm going to work at this. And so that's my goal.